According to the theorists in the previous chapter, language is a core part of understanding culture. In this chapter, we will explore what really is the relationship between language and culture. Are these two terms mean the same thing? Hello everyone, I am Grace A. Ampis. Welcome to my discussion on culture and language. However, I will be focusing and emphasizing two of its components, the language relativity and the language culture nexus. The best idea in understanding the relationship between language and culture is through language relativity. Language relativity is the idea that through language, we learn to categorize and make sense of the world and at the same time organize our thoughts. This idea was associated with anthropologists and linguists Franz Boas, Edward Sapir, and Benjamin Whorf. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis states that the real world is to a large extent unconsciously built up on the language habits of the group. This means that speakers of different languages will have different ways of interpreting and understanding the world. To put it simply, different languages means different cultures. There are two interpretations of the hypothesis. First is the strong form of linguistic relativity, also known as linguistic determinism. It is the idea that our language constrains and put limits on how we understand the world and think. Thus, we are fixed into the worldview and culture that we learn through our first language. However, the idea was argued by scholars. According to Leavitt, it was misinterpretation of linguistic relativity. Empirical evidence and theoretical developments shown that such deterministic correlation between language, culture, and thought cannot be true. Because if it were, it is impossible to understand someone from another language and learn additional languages. The weak form of linguistic relativity proposes that the language we speak influences our thoughts and our understanding of the world, but does not control or limit them. This interpretation has been much more influential in linguistics and has received support from empirical evidence. One of the main contributions of this understanding of linguistic relativity is the insight that there are particular things that a language must convey, while also recognizing that this does not put limit on what language can convey. These take the form of grammatical categories such as tense and number in Western languages. Similar argument made by Everett. He says that cognition plus culture plus communication equals language. This means that each human being has a brain, belongs to a community with values, and needs to communicate, and the confluence of these states results to language. We need to be careful that we do not overgeneralize this link between language and culture to assume that particular cultures are embedded or fixed into particular languages. Anna Wisbichka argued and proposed that different languages contains cultural scripts which are inherent to those languages. In relation to English, Wisbichka claims that even when it is used as a global language, there is still an internal cultural baggage to language, so that English that ASEAN has used from the outset as its only language is essentially Anglo-English, and it bears the imprint of the cultural history of the English language. Now we are down to language culture nexus. In language relativity, we see that language and culture are closely linked together. On the other hand, particular languages are not necessarily linked to a particular culture. For example, the English language is not fixed in its connections to British or US culture. First, we can distinguish between different perspectives and locations of language. Second, we can closely examine how languages and cultures connect through the notion of the language-culture nexus or language-culture interface. The different dimensions of language and communication will help us see how language and culture can be both connected and separated. The first dimension is the psychological or cognitive perspective, which focuses on individual linguistic resources. It is the person's mental or cognitive representation and processing of language communication. The second dimension is the sociological or microsocial perspective, which focuses on linguistic practices, how individuals use linguistic resources in communication. According to Reisiger, these two dimensions or perspective of language are the natural loci of language. To put it simply, these two perspectives describe how linguistic resources are used in actual communication. The third dimension to language is an artificial and ideological construct or the system-oriented point of view. This is the idea of language as a delineated and describable entity or system and includes named national languages such as English, French, or Japanese. Similar to national cultures, the constructed ideology of national languages is a powerful one. that influences the natural cognitive and sociological dimensions to language. The psychological or cognitive dimension of language and culture are always connected since linguistic resources are learned as part of social cultural experiences and have associated meaning for the individual. In other words, when we learn a word, phrase, or structure of language, it always has a meaning or purpose for us related to the cultural setting in which it was learned. This type of connection between language and culture is referred to as lingua culture or lingua culture. This means that there can be no such thing as culturally neutral language. All communication involves participants, contexts, and purposes. However, in sociological dimension, the meaning and purpose of linguistic resources will be based on every individual's life history, and so meaning will be more or less similar depending on history of interactants in communication have. People who grow up in the same community and learn the same L1 or first language will most likely share many similar interpretations of the language. For example, people who learn British English as their language 1 or first language and grow up in UK may share similar cultural experiences and references, and so the links between the English language and British culture will be close. In contrast, people using the same language, for example, English as a lingua franca but with very different life histories and cultural experiences, may have different interpretations of the language which are related to their own cultural contexts and hence far removed from British culture. So, in this sense, language and culture can be separated. Another distinction which helps us to explain how language and culture can be both linked and separable is through generic sense of language and culture and the differential sense of language and culture. The generic sense of language and culture refers to the general phenomena of language and culture. It states that language and culture are always linked. As Reisiger's writes, human language is always embedded in culture. The differential sense of language and culture is referring to the particular language that links to a particular national culture, the English language and Britain culture, for example. The coming together of language and culture is what Reisiger calls the language-culture nexus and involves the union of linguistic and cultural resources in a particular communicative event. Let us have an example on how language and culture come together in complex and variable ways. The conversation is predominantly in English, but it is in English as a lingua franca or ELF, since the participants are the Thai L1 speaker named Nami and an L1 Belgian French speaker named Philippe. The conversation takes place in a cafe in a shopping mall in Bangkok named MBK, and the subject is a cosplay or costume play, in which fans of Japanese manga, anime, and pop music dress up and role-play their favorite characters. In this example, English is not used at any point to refer to English or Anglophone cultural practices or setting, or by speakers who would identify as part of the Anglophone culture. Rather, English is used to represent and construct a range of cultural practices that move across local, national, and global scales. Indeed, language and culture are inextricably related. As a language teacher, we must thoroughly study these terms and share its impact to our learners, because language and culture play a crucial function in our individuality and in our society as a whole. And that ends the discussion of my part. Thank you so much for listening.
Hi, this is Danielle. To continue the discussion on the links between language and culture, I will talk about 3 more approaches in addition to my partner's assignment. She already discussed linguistic relativity and language-culture nexus. Mine are culture and language flows, language, culture, and complexity theory, and language and culture as repertoires and resources. Culture and language flows. The increased connection and engagement between people and communities at a global scale have implications on language and culture flows. Transnational or transcultural flows increase the scale of complexity and social networks and the flows of cultural practices and ideologies. According to Reisewer 2006 in her transnational paradigm, languages and cultures are spreading across each other in networks of linguistic and cultural flows. And according to Cook 2007, he views transcultural flows as the process of borrowing, blending, remaking, and returning to the process of alternative cultural production. For example, English is a translocal language, a language of fluidity and fixity that moves across cultures while becoming embedded in localities and social relations. To illustrate, global languages such as English can be seen moving through globally connected networks, but being adapted and changed to local sociocultural settings, and then passing on again in a constant flow to new settings where the process of change continue. To illustrate more, let us use the concept of the globally connected cultural practice of hip-hop. While this musical genre originated in Bronx, New York in the 70s, by the African American and Latino American who believe that people can take control of their lives through self-knowledge and self-expression, it does not appear exactly the same as the hip-hops, say for example in Ukraine or Russia or in the Philippines. Linguistically speaking, local hip-hops mix local vocabularies as part of the lyrics, though there could be English in that pieces. Contextually, local hip-hops refer to local settings or situations. Therefore, transcultural flow and the use of English across the globe do not lead to homogenization of culture, but complexification. There is a tension between fluidity and fixity of language and culture in their connections. The fourth approach that we are to discuss in this culture and language link is language, culture, and complexity theory. Complexity theory views the connection between language and culture the same as the language-culture nexus and the cultural and linguistic flows. The complex adaptive system are systems in which interaction of individual components gives rise to the emergence of a more complex aggregate pattern, which cannot be reduced or explained according to the individual features. As John Miller and Scott Page say that in a complex system, we will understand the system as a whole if we perfectly understand its component. To illustrate, if 1 and 1 makes 2, we will understand the aggregate or the aggregate 2 if we know both 1 and the meaning of n. We cannot understand the whole system by examining just one part of it. This means that culture arises from beliefs, behaviors, and interactions of individuals, but it is not reducible to any one individual, and also that individual cannot represent all of the culture system. The same is true with language. Language system arise out of interactions of individuals who make use of the language in their communicative interactions. However, an individual an individual language use will not be the same as the description of the system, since individuals vary in their language use, and each person makes use of linguistic resources associated with language system in different ways. The fifth approach in looking at the link between language and culture is the language and culture repertoires and resources. In the fluidity and diversity of intercultural and transcultural communications, individuals are seen to have a range of linguistic resources for communication. The combination of all the individual's linguistic resources is his or her linguistic repertoire. If someone's linguistic resources are only those associated with one named language, example English, he would be viewed as having monolingual repertoire. If an individual has linguistic resources from various named languages, example English, French, Spanish, and Filipino, he or she would be viewed as having multilingual repertoire. Now, one does not have to be proficient in all areas of particular language for it to be part of his repertoires. As Blumart argues that we never know all of a language. We just know bits and pieces of it, even of our mother tongue, as well as for the language we pick in our lifetime. This is called truncated repertoire. Alongside our linguistic resources, there is another set of resources like semiotic and multimodal resources, like images, gestures, tools, and other external objects, place and positioning, which comprise our communicative repertoire. Our linguistic resources or repertoire are often linked to the particular sociocultural settings in which we learn. Example, we learn our first language at home, in our neighborhood, in the market, and we learned our second language, say English for us Filipinos, in schools, at the workplace, or in situations and settings we interact with English-speaking individuals.